My game of the day from round 6 of Norway Chess is Giri with the white pieces against Pentala Harikrishna. Harikrishna has just come off an excellent victory against Li Chao, so he's back up to 50%, and Giri also on 50%. E4 from Giri, and E6, so no Sicilian, no E5, no Spanish. You know, the French is something of a rare visitor at the elite level. I think probably because it's such a complex opening and it can suddenly go very badly wrong for black if you're not careful, because in these closed positions sometimes it's very hard to fight out of your difficulties. Anyway, it's great to see it. I'm a big fan of the French defence, and particularly of this classical variation that Harikrishna plays. I used to play this myself, and it's one of my recommendations on my French DVD. I really like the classical. Now, a couple of days ago, Grandelius played Bishop G5, and we saw takes on E4, and Harikrishna played this very sharp variation against him. But Giri played E5 today, so we had this typical French pawn structure, and C5 attacking D4, and well, this is the starting point of many variations that black can play. You could say the old main line was to play like this, and then to take on D4 and Bishop C5, but you can also play with A6 and then B5, also very reasonable. But recently players have been playing Bishop E7 and just delaying the exchange on D4. And here, well, Knight C6 is the normal move, but and this is interesting, and this is one of my recommendations on the DVD actually. But very interestingly, Harikrishna castles straight away, and this has some significance because after Queen D2, now Knight C6 will be normal, but he plays B6, so just delaying the development of the knight and preparing perhaps to exchange off the so-called bad bishop with Bishop A6. And of course the other thing about B6 is that it discourages white from taking on C5, because in this case then this would give black these two wonderful central pawns, so you can't do that. So what does white do here? Well, very often in these lines white likes to castle on the queenside, but that would really be a mistake, because this is quite well known that black gets in this big pawn wedge and then follows up with B5, and this is a really irresistible attack. Previously Giri has had this position, and he played Bishop E2 against Morozevich. Morozevich, one of the great exponents of this line in the French, and well, he really didn't get any advantage in this position at all. Let me just go on a few moves. You can see here that after this exchange, black had this absolutely typical pressure against down the F file, but also on the C file, and this knight comes to this excellent square looking to play into E4, supported by the bishop and the pawn. Absolutely typical French stuff. So Giri played something different today. He retreated the knight to D1, which I quite like actually, because it prepares to support the pawn on D4 and also switches the knight potentially to a better square on F2, perhaps going to the king side, perhaps swing around to D3. And now Harikrishna starts his queenside counterplay. Watch out for this A-pawn. So C3, bolstering the centre. Now you could play Bishop A6 straight away, but this is clever, A4. And this pawn is very annoying. I mean, this is a very typical kind of strategy in the French, that black advances this a pawn to undermine white's pawn chain here. And if this pawn is blocked, then black can use that knight and come into one of these squares here. Knight f2 I think is a reasonable move here. But Giri played bishop d3, that's also fine, and now bishop a6. Exchanging off that bad bishop. And here, well, there was a game I found where white played bishop c2, trying to preserve this dangerous bishop. But this really is very risky, because now white king can't castle, and suddenly black gets excellent play here, and typically opening up the c file, and once again we see opening up the f file as well. And white's king has problems, because even on the queen side, it's not going to be very safe. So castles from Giri, okay, absolutely normal. Bishop a6, rook a6, and here Giri played a very, very tempting move. He advanced with f5, this absolutely standard break in the French, but incredibly this kind of rebounds on him. With hindsight, I think just the simple knight f2, just bringing the knight around, possibly going to d3, but just connecting the rooks, it's important. Maybe later on going here, maybe to h3. It's interesting to see, f5 looks absolutely normal, but Harikrishna reacts in such a cool way. First of all, if this is captured, then queen d3 is annoying because it hits rook and pawn, so white recovers that pawn, and okay, with this nice pawn on e5 should be better for white. But Harikrishna plays very coolly. b5. So this continues queenside expansion and still wants to try and undermine white's pawn chain. Also, this can be useful. The rook can sometimes protect along the third rank. And now Giri couldn't find anything better. I mean, now this is probably a threat, just to take this pawn. And it's not really possible to follow up this attack in a good way. I mean, at first I thought, well, if you're going to do this, then you should go the whole hog. You should just give up this pawn and open black's king. But actually, black has very good defensive resources here. If bishop h6, then black would be very happy to ditch an exchange and just get a huge pawn centre. And if pawn takes pawn, well, you can recapture with both knight and bishop, but it's nice to plonk that knight in the middle of the board and just ditch the exchange, and this is fantastic compensation for black. A pawn plus this huge knight in the middle. And, you know, if only this knight weren't stuck on the back rank, you know, it's going to take white some time to get his pieces into play, and because of that I think black has very good compensation for the exchange. So Giri instead exchanged on e6, but I think that's kind of an admission that this whole strategy with f5 really didn't add up to much, because I think really only black can use the f file here. I mean, certainly black's king has no difficulties now. And again, I thought knight f2 was okay. Queen e2 played, but attacking this, and the queen defended it. I mean, the queen is now on an excellent square on b6. Knight f2. Okay, finally. And now Harikrishna continues his strategy of undermining this pawn chain, and this is very difficult. I mean, clearly you don't want to take, because this just gives black fantastic play against these pawns. So b3, but now that pawn on a2 is a potential target, and b4, excellent, continuing to undermine this pawn chain. It's very difficult for white. So Giri was forced to trade, and you can see that potentially the pawn on e5 is actually weak now. So this strategy begun with a3 has paid off just superbly, and black has a clear advantage now. So if pawn takes pawn here, then knight takes pawn, and clearly better for black with pressure. Giri tried c4, but this also wasn't satisfactory. Knight e4, excellent moves. This knight so often ends up on this superb outpost in the French. So that knight that started on g8 swings around from f6 to d7 and then into e4. It's a very well-known and happy journey for the knight. So white traded on d5. Now the obvious thing to do would be to step out of this pin, but actually if white tries to do that, then you trade and then you just play knight takes e5. So white is caught in a pin here. Obviously knight takes knight, then rook takes rook, and queen takes knight. Impossible because the rook hangs. So Giri in massive trouble here. Can't step out of the pin easily. He played e6. Okay, looks like it's a bit of a randomizer, but well, Harikrishna thought for 21 minutes here and came up with an excellent move, a very simple move. He simply blockaded this pawn, and although this looks like a retreat, in fact this pawn is now in massive trouble, and the knight securely holds the d5 pawn, and black just has a huge advantage. King steps out of the pin, but now the knight comes to an even better square, c3, looking at the a2 pawn, hitting the queen as well. Okay, watch out for knight g5, no problem, h6, and now it's lost. Knight d4 looks like a natural move to hold the pawn. Simple move for black. In reply, rook f4 hits the knight, and you can't defend the knight because with rook d1 because the knight would simply take it. So the natural move doesn't work. Giri tried to exchange off that knight, and now Harikrishna, I'm sure with great relief, saw that he could trade queens with queen b5, because obviously that's a kind of pin or a skewer or something. So queens were traded, and rook takes e6. So black a whole pawn up now. Although Harikrishna now returns it very nicely. So after rook here, he now plays knight c3, an excellent move. Now clearly Giri can't live with that knight there. If that knight is then cemented on c3, it would be hopeless. So he really had to take the pawn on b4. So material is now even, but with this rook coming into e2, this is terrible. It's lost. Rook c7 wasn't one last little trick. If black captures the pawn straight away, then rook a7 picks up the a pawn. So very cool move from Harikrishna. Rook a8, just supporting the pawn, preventing rook a7, and now there's just a couple of tricks, but it's gone. Rook takes pawn. Now you just have to watch out for some attack here, but it's nothing. Rook d2, good move. The rook can't even come to f7 because there's a mate on the back rank, and if knight e6, then you keep pushing a2. That's gone. In the game, Giri played h3, but then a2, and no time for rook up because you just make a queen, and that is obviously lost. Queen threatened, and rook takes knight. Really smooth game by Harikrishna, and it's great to see a French defence again at the elite level. So that means after 6 rounds, Carlsen still leads with 4 out of 6. He had quite a tough game today against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, who pushed him hard, but Carlsen defended well. Then there are 4 players a half a point behind on 3.5. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Topalov, Harikrishna and Kramnik. 3 rounds to go.